All right, hello, and this is chapter 19, fire cause or fire origin and cause determination, firefighter 1. Before we go any farther, I just want to make sure that everybody understands that that this course is an awareness only. All right, it does not train you to be a fire investigator, and a little knowledge can be a dangerous thing. You do not want to go mucking about at an incident scene, at a fire that could be suspicious and end up ruining any kind of evidence that could be obtained. So keep this in mind as we go through. This is an awareness only. If you're interested in fire investigation, it is very fascinating. The Academy has a course that you can go to. And a little bit later, after you've done some firefighting and got some years of service in the fire service. So with that, go ahead and move on. So learning objective 1, explain ways to recognize obvious signs of the area of origin. You know, two things that we need to understand about how fires start, and we've covered a lot of this in fire behavior. Right, so what we need is a precise point of origin, a place where the fire started, and some kind of ignition source. So normally the area of origin has the greatest amount of damage and the greatest amount of debris. This is where most of the fire occurs. So this is where you're going to see a lot of the damage to the structure itself. Maybe sheetrock is missing, or in other areas of the house it isn't. You'll see very deep alligatoring on support members, wood. So anytime that we work on a fire scene, and again, this goes back to some of the very basic things we've been talking about, assume that there is potentially lethal concentrations of gas present. We've already covered some of those things like carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide, hydrogen chloride, or I'm sorry, cyanide, not hydrogen chloride, cyanide. So we want to make sure that before we go into any of those areas that we have had somebody come in with an air monitor to clear the air. And until that happens, we're going to wear full PPE. And as you remember, full PPE includes SCBA. All right, so debris on the fire scene will tell you where the fire started and what caused the fire maybe, and give you some information on where the fire is going. So the thing to remember is that anything that you pick up in terms of possible ignition sources, ignition causes, any kind of evidence that would indicate that the fire was intentionally set could be used in court. And if not used in court, it can be used in civil proceedings, like an insurance company, for example, may not pay out insurance on a structure fire if it was determined that the owner or the occupant actually set the fire. And of course, also the other result is that there could be some criminal charges in terms of arson. All right, so the term I was trying to think of, and I had to think about it here for a minute, was competency. So in order for evidence to be heard in court, it has to be competent. If the defense can prove that the evidence was out of somebody's custody at any point in time, it could render that evidence inadmissible in court, because then it could be argued that while it was outside of the custody of the authorities, someone tampered with the evidence to make it look like the client was guilty. So it's very important that as the firefighter on the scene, when you see evidence, you want to stand by it, preserve it. Let the IC know that you think there's some evidence there, and so that chain of custody kind of starts with you, and it'll continue every time that evidence is turned over. It's recorded on a sheet, so that can be taken to court to prove that the evidence was always in the possession of the authorities. All right, so the next part of this evidence process is your documentation. And it's very important that on incidents that you feel are suspicious, that you record what you see, what you smell, what you hear, anything you observe. You want to document that in your fire incident report. That fire incident report, once it's completed, becomes an official record and can be subpoenaed in court. The only way you're going to remember what you saw, what you smelled, or what you heard, or any other observation is if you've written it down. There's an old saying that goes in report writing that if you didn't write it down, it didn't happen. So even if your recollection is correct, if you say that you saw something but it wasn't recorded, then your testimony becomes in question. So now, with that in mind, we want to, I want to stress that it's important that anything, we're going to use the incident priorities. Priority 1 is life safety. Number 2 is incident stabilization. Third is property conservation. When it doesn't interfere with those priorities, we want to minimize fire suppression overhaul activities until somebody's come in to actually look at evidence, collect evidence to determine the origin and the cause of the fire. So just kind of keep that in the back of your head. Sometimes going to a call that it's suspicious. The third rekindle on a house probably is suspicious. So at that point, you really want to think about minimizing what you do on the scene to put out the fire. So there are several factors that'll go into finding the area of origin and kind of improve the success or improve the chance of success of the investigation. So some of these things may be apparent, some of them are not. Follow, if nothing else, if it is not apparent, follow from the least amount of damage to the most damage. We kind of do that kind of in reverse and overhaul. We go from the most severe damage to the area of no damage. But if we're not sure where it started, follow the trail. Some things are critical to overall success. Identifying who witnesses are, who may have seen things, who may have heard things. Anybody can give you information. You want to secure the scene. We cannot allow people to get access to the scene because that could taint evidence. You want to note the initial scene. What was it like? And this kind of goes back into some of your documentation requirements that you'll want to take good or make good notes in your report about what you saw when you first got there. Where was the fire? How much fire was there? What else did you see when you got there? What else did you observe? The incident commander or the criminal investigator, the fire investigator, will be the one that actually determines where the fire started and what caused the fire, and also be responsible for protecting or collecting evidence. In wildland or ground cover fires, there's an organization called the International Association of Arson Investigators, the IAAI. They have a podcast that covers different fire investigations, different things that relate to fire investigations, and they recently had a 2-episode podcast on wildland or ground cover fire investigation. There's actually a place out west where they intentionally set ground cover fires for the class that goes there. So that may require some a little bit some different experience, maybe some more experience, um, because there are different factors involved in those. So before we even go in the house, we want to take a look at the outside. The outside is really can give us some clues on a number of different things. And looking at this slide here, we can see where the smoke and fire patterns were from the windows and from the front door. That's a clue. We look for maybe other things on the outside, uh, maybe some containers of flammable fuels, things like that. And one of the other things that I learned in my fire investigation class is that if there's a crowd there at the looking at the fire, that's the first thing you notice. That's the first thing you want to look at. And take a recording, either a photograph or video of the people who are watching, and then turn your attention to the actual fire. A lot of times arsonists will stick around to basically watch their work and see how that goes. All right, so when you can't determine the cause or the origin rather, you want to kind of go not go anything further than as far as overhaul goes beyond extinguishing fires. When we overhaul, and we've covered salvage and overhaul previously, you know that we're going to take walls apart, we're going to rip up carpet, we're going to do all kinds of things to ensure that there aren't any hidden fires, that we're not going to have a rekindle. In this case, where we don't know where the origin is, we want to delay that overhaul to protect whatever evidence we have. We want to protect the scene, make sure people aren't going through. We don't have a parade going through, looking at stuff, and make sure that we establish scene security. And I think this may be covered a little bit further on. I'm pretty sure it is. That scene security involved when we think we have or know that we have a suspicious fire. We want to record who goes in and out. That becomes evidence as well during investigation and could be in court as well to determine who may have gone in or out if there's any question about what was found originally and what was found later. All right, so there are a couple things that we want to do when we examine the scene. Interior examination. Um, we're going to look at fire patterns. We're going to look at melted metal and glass. And this is where some of your building construction training and education comes into play. If you've gone a little bit further than that to kind of look at the melting temperatures of different types of materials like metal, different metals and glass and plastics and things like that, then you can get a good estimate of what the temperatures were in different parts of the room. You're going to look at the degree of damage to the structure and to the contents. Again, always document what you see, what you find, preserve any kind of evidence, and specific. All right, so some specific observations where I've talked about building damage, but look at things like broken windows. If any of the doors were forced, if there's any sign of forcible entry anywhere else. And for safety reasons, you're going to look at how stable the structure is. You're going to look at the means of ingress and egress for safety purposes, again, to make sure everybody's got a way in and out. You're going to look for tracks or footprints. And you want to take a look at tracks and footprints near windows and other openings like doors. And there's some periods during the year, some seasons that kind of help us with that. For example, spring, people may redo their flower beds and put new dirt down, new soil, potting soil. Um, Snow can give us some good footprints during the winter. So you want to be looking for that. Look for tire tracks. I already talked about that, but all right. You'll look at this for discarded containers, and you want to look at unusual containers. Not, most some arsonists are going to use a typical gas can. Sometimes it's something else. Sometimes it could be as simple as a plastic water bottle. So you're going to want to look for all types of different containers. And note the location of any surveillance cameras, not just on that structure, but on adjacent structures. Many businesses have surveillance cameras. The footage can be subpoenaed as part of the investigation, especially if it points towards the house, or the footage may show parts of the structure, and that could be a very good way to track down what actually happened. All right, so as you go from the interior, usually start the area of least damage and work towards the area of greatest damage. Again, some of the indicators that you're going to be looking at, you're going to be looking at fire patterns. The photo on this slide, that's more smoke damage and heat damage than fire damage. There's no obvious fire patterns per se on that photo. But there could be fire patterns, especially against the wall. You look at things like outlets, switches, electrical equipment, things like that. And as I mentioned earlier, melted glass, melted metal, anything else, the degree of damage to the contents and the structure itself. All right, so charring on floors and vertical surfaces can give us a lot of good information in fires that are started with flammable liquids, like the photo on the left. You'll see particular patterns like that. If it is run down a hallway, we call those trailers. You have specific burn patterns because that fuel burns off pretty quick. Sometimes it may be hidden by carpets. So at some point during the investigation, carpets will have to come up so you can actually see the floor underneath. The greatest amount of damage always faces towards the point of origin. And you can see from the photo on the right that as you look from the left to the right at that doorway, you know that the greatest amount of damage is off to the right, so that is going towards that point of origin. All right, so one key in arson investigation, I'm not going to call it a telltale sign, but a sign that gives us a high degree or high index of suspicion that arson has occurred is when multiple origins are detected. And sometimes, however, that can be because of natural reasons. There are a lot of different things that can point to that, but that's one of the like I said, one of the signs that we have a piece of evidence that gives a high index of suspicion that arson has occurred. So other things, factors that affect fire spread, a lot of this stuff is things that you've already had: building construction, fire behavior, ventilation, what kind of materials are in the fire's path, building features, how the building's laid out, if there have been any kind of undocumented building renovations done that's changed the layout kind of thing, where the ventilation openings, and these aren't just windows and doors, but maybe skylights, chimneys, things like that. what kind of materials are in the building. We talked about fire load before, and that can have a lot to do with fire spread. How we fight these fires can affect fire spread. Unfortunately, sometimes we can push the fire a little bit. We can influence the fire spread, maybe the direction a little bit, by suppressing it in one area. So how we actually put the fire out can have a lot to do with fire spread. So in cases of suspicious fires, we want to document fire suppression tactics probably a little in more detail than we normally would. And then look at the suppression systems to see if they've been activated. Had they been activated? If they weren't activated, why not? Were they turned off? Were they shut off illegally? So those are just some things to take a look at in looking at fire spread. And then just kind of be aware of just some general patterns within the structure that just don't look right. Maybe they don't match what you saw on the outside or match what the owner or the occupant said was going on. If there's a question, call an investigator. All right, so when we have a total structural loss, it presents a lot of challenges. Obviously, there's really not a whole lot of evidence left to take a look at. In many cases, it's very hard to tell where it started, and finding a cause is almost impossible. So those are kind of hard to investigate. Which is, and I'll put a plug in here. Investigators, we have a number of people who are qualified fire investigators in the county that can come to the scene if you ask dispatch, but the state fire marshal is the one that actually does the real serious investigations. And so my plug here is that if when you're arriving on the scene, you think you have a suspicious fire, call for a fire investigator. The best time for a fire investigator to really start their investigation is while the fire is still going on. They can see a lot, from their experience. They can kind of get a better idea what's going on if they're in that dynamic situation. So I added this slide here because we now have a number of resources that we can use to get an idea what the structure looked like beforehand. Your book on page 1150, are we in page 1150 already? Wow. Determining the greatest damage is even more difficult due to the complete consumption of combustible materials and the unknown ventilation factors that existed during the fire. We have Google Maps, Google Earth, and GIS that can give us actual photos of the structure before the fire, the layout, that kind of thing. If you're lucky, sometimes those photos are taken at a time when maybe you can determine who's normally there, or if a car was there. They get dated, of course, but that is one way to look at a structure. I would encourage you to look up your address on Google Maps and go to the picture function. And you'd be surprised. I mean, they take pictures of everybody's houses now, so you can get a look at what the house looked like or the structure looked like before the fire. Exterior fires are very different, and we've talked a lot about ground cover fires, but there are stored materials, stacked materials. We talked about fires in piled material like lumberyard. We talked about debris fields. We talked about trash, such as dumpster fires, rubbish fires. A lot of those are what goes on in people's backyards sometime. And ground cover vegetation fires. All of those kind of burn different types of materials. So, and just as a quick review of what we learned during the ground cover fires, remember the basic fire behavior in a ground cover fire is a little different than structural fire, but it's still hot and hot air still rises. But in wildland fires, the effects of winds are much greater. The topography, the steeper the topography, the faster the fire will move up. The natural fuels that are there contribute to fire spread, and unless they're impacted by anything outside the fire itself, in other words, wind, topography, etc., ground cover fires burn outward in all directions. And if the fuel load is equal, if we don't have any wind or topography issues, it should be a fairly equal circle around the fire origin. So wind, obviously, in this diagram here, will give us a different kind of shape to our fire. The fire towards the heel of the ground cover fire is going to be probably less damage than maybe at the head, because the heat has moved on. All right, so again, just kind of as a review, wind direction and velocity affect fire spread in ground cover fires. Types of fuel, the ambient temperature, relative humidity, and the moisture content of fuel, all of that is review. So that has those characteristics have a lot of impact on the rate and direction of ground fire spreads. All right, so the area of origin in a ground cover fire will show evidence of slower, less intense fire growth, and it may even be some unburned materials. The effects of flame or the fire itself on fuels is less than is at the head, as I've said before. When you're looking at a point of origin in grass, radiant heat, as going back to fire behavior and heat transfer, radiant heat affects adjacent fuels, and it affects the side of the fuel that faces that radiant heat, right? So you'll see the back sides of grass, blades of grass, or the trunks of trees protected. You won't see fire or heat damage there. It'll be on the front. Grass falls towards the area of origin, and the white ash product is more of an indication of complete combustion. So as you're looking at a grass fire, all things being equal, if you're looking for the point of origin, look for where the grass is kind of bending towards that origin. Maybe very small, but it should be there. All right, so finding the area of origin for vehicle fires is very similar to what we do when we look at investigating structural fires. We're searching for that area of origin. We're going to interview witnesses and firefighters, and really examine the interior and the exterior. Smaller cars, it's going to be pretty easy to tell. Again, if you have a fire that starts in the engine compartment, that'll be the area you're going to find most damage, even if it spreads to the rest of the car. Again, just like structural fires, if the vehicle is fully involved when you get there, there's no way to tell. A lot of that evidence is gone. But where you're going to see vehicle fire investigations, maybe high-value cargo, like semi-trailers, and anything else that may be carrying high-value cargoes. Probably where you're going to see that the most, unless maybe there's a death or serious injury involved or anything suspicious. So some things to keep in mind when you're looking at a vehicle fire. Remember that undeployed airbags are a danger, and you want to make sure they're deactivated. Ensure shock absorber bumpers are inoperable. You want to remember the dangers, the hazards with hybrid electrical cars. We've talked about those, the different types of fuels that are used on those. We don't want to cut the posts that contain any restraint systems. There are devices in there that can cause some harm. The pyrotechnic seatbelt restraints, in particular, can cause us harm if we cut through them. So know where large capacity or multiple fuel cells may exist, and with tractor trailers, they're generally the saddlebags on either side of the cab behind the driver. Other vehicles, some clues that we may be dealing with larger fuel tanks or multiple fuel tanks or very large pickups, like those with the fifth wheel adapter on it. They may carry more fuel. Hydraulic systems operate under high pressure, so particularly hydraulic cylinders, for example, they can explode if they're heated beyond the point that would compromise their structural integrity. Check the trunk area for any flammables or combustibles, and anything else that might be helpful. All right, so as a warning, do not attempt to access or examine a vehicle unless you know how to do so safely. And as firefighter ones, this is probably something that you're going to want to allow a more senior firefighter to do until you get more knowledgeable about that, especially alternative fuel vehicles and electrical vehicles. All right, so as a review question, just kind of go back and review what ways you can recognize obvious signs of a fire's area of origin. All right, learning objective 2. We're going to talk about the relationship between fire cause classifications and cause determination. So as I said at the beginning, we're looking for a competent ignition source. I didn't say it quite this way, but we're going to look for two things: a competent ignition source and an ignition sequence. So what are those? A competent ignition source is an ignition source with sufficient temperature and energy and will be in contact with fuel long enough to actually cause ignition, to raise that fuel to its ignition temperature. The ignition sequence is basically the steps or the process where that ignition source causes the fire to start. It starts at the ignition source and the first fuel ignited meet at the origin and proceeding through the entire duration of the fire spread through the scene. So we're looking at when it starts, how it starts, and where it goes to. So why do we do determinations? There are four basic reasons. One, we want to document the causes of the fire. This can be important if it's a criminal investigation. It can also be important, as I mentioned before, in civil proceedings, that if we can rule out that a fire was not a case of arson, then an owner-occupant has less of a hassle with the insurance company. Insurance companies may send their own fire investigators. Many of them have them. For those of you that are interested in fire investigation, if you once you get some experience, some time in the service under your belt, you go to the fire investigation class and get some investigations under your belt, that could be a good retirement gig for you later on. The second reason is that it can be an indication of unsafe behavior. And the purpose of doing that is we can identify things people do that's unsafe that causes fires. We can take steps to correct that behavior. Sometimes it's as simple as education. For example, plugging in multiple high amp devices into a single outlet. That's an unsafe behavior that can cause fires. The third reason is that we can indicate if there's, or find if there's a defective equipment or design flaws. This is how some devices, or the defects in some devices, get identified, is when they actually fault, when they actually cause a fire. So if we can determine that a piece of equipment was involved and try to determine why it happened, then the manufacturer can take steps to fix that equipment. And the fourth reason, obviously, is arson, malicious, illegal behavior, whether it was intentional or not. Those are all reasons we do a cause determination. So NFIRS reports include basically more than four, several types of causes of fires in structures. Incendiary, that's your arson, open flame, ember, or torch. There's still people that use candles in unsafe ways. Other heat, flame, or spark, that could be, for example, a fireplace that doesn't have a spark screen in front of it. People still smoke in bed. They discard smoking materials incorrectly. Lightning or other natural causes. Heating equipment, cooking equipment, and one that jumps out every Thanksgiving is the use of deep fat fryers for turkeys, done unsafe. That can cause a major fire. And then faults in electrical or lighting equipment. Those are all some of the causes. Some more HVAC system, HVAC appliances, other equipment. Be anything that's plugged into the house, anything that is plugged into the in the business, any kind of like packing machines or sorting machines, anything like that. It could be the result of an exposure. We talked about exposures and heat transfer and why protecting exposures is so important. And lastly, children playing with matches, lighters, or other ignition sources. So there are four types of fire cause classifications: accidental, natural, incendiary, and undetermined. So accidental does not involve a deliberate act, but it could be that it's just an unsafe behavior, like the one I mentioned before, plugging in multiple high amp devices into a single socket. Natural fires, the most common is lightning. Earthquakes and tornadoes and floods and other types of disasters can cause fires as well. Incendiary fires, those are your arson fires, the ones that are set deliberately. And then undetermined. And one of the important things to remember about undetermined is that this is when you can't find an origin, you can't find a cause. Sometimes this is going to be the case in the structures that are totally destroyed by fire, and there's just no way that you can make a classification. One of the things that you do not want to do is use undetermined for a suspicious fire. If it truly is undetermined, that means that you can't rule in arson. You can't rule in accidental or natural. So if the cause is suspicious, don't use the classification of undetermined. All right, so some obvious signs to look for. I mean, here in this photo, we've got a number of things that are kind of circled. These are all potential ignition sources. We've got the oven, the gas stove. We have the oven. We have an electrical appliance. We have electrical receptacles, anything plugged into them. Exposed wiring, anything like that. So, when we're looking at something, particularly if the area is not totally destroyed, then we want to start looking at each individual piece as we go through the process. Uh, all right, so again, what are some of the visual signs that would help you determine the area of origin for ground cover fires? I mean, these are again just kind of a review, but it's important to know. So just kind of go back and reread that section on ground cover fires, and make sure that you know those. Okay, so the absence of ignition source can actually be helpful because it can eliminate some causes and enable investigators to focus on other causes. Um, so the absence of evidence in one area can help point towards something that could be the cause. All right, so learning objective 3, recognize signs of arson. Now, again, remember what I said at the very beginning. This is not a course to certify you as a fire investigator. This is an awareness level course only, awareness level education only. So the reason we're training firefighters, firefighter ones in this area is because you guys are on the front line. You're on the nozzle, you're inside. So recognizing these as you're going through even fire suppression can help alert the IC to potential suspicious situation and request a fire investigator. All right, so you're going to have to provide some information if incendiary or undetermined cause is initially indicated or initially thought. And this is, you're going to gather the information based on the observations of you and the other firefighters. Now, obviously, if you're the junior firefighter, you're not going to be collecting this information. That would fall on the IC or the unit officer or one of the other officers on the scene. But gathering these observations together and documenting those in your report is very, very important. And the way this course is set up, local or state fire investigators, sometimes law enforcement officials, do the actual formal investigation. If we're talking about, and that can change, you could have the alcohol, tobacco, and firearms, ATF, show up there if there's an area of concern for them. If it's a homicide, you could have a state fire investigator and a homicide detective from TBI there. So it really kind of depends, but the formal investigation, for our purposes, is done by somebody else, either local, state fire investigators. Some of the things that you want to kind of document, take a look at, and consider is the time of day. If a fire occurs in the middle of the night in a house, you would figure most people would still be in their pajamas, right? So if you roll up on a house fire and everybody's in their street clothes, that would be a little suspicious. Or business in the middle of the night, you'd have to explain, the owner would have to explain why he or she was on the scene in street clothes in the middle of the night, assuming that it's not a 24-hour operation. Weather and other natural hazards, the temperature, severe weather, storms, lightning, any kind of other natural hazards that may have been going on in the area. You want to document those. Any man-made barriers, like that photo there, that back door is completely blocked by rubbish and people leaving the scene. Most of you probably got into this because you love firefighting, but really kind of what brings a lot of people into this occupation is they're fascinated with fire and fire behavior. I mean, people just love staring at a campfire, just watching the fire burn. So it's really kind of unnatural for somebody to be leaving the scene, especially if they're leaving at a high rate of speed. Any kind of suspicious vehicle leaving the scene, try to get as much detail as you can to report that. And this is why, obviously at the very beginning of the fire, we're not going to be worrying about anything else other than the incident priorities. But if we've got time, maybe the pump operator can pull out their personal phone and just take pictures of the people that are watching, that kind of thing. We can maybe get a lead from that. All right, so another thing to look at is the location and spread of the fire, or your time of arrival and extent of fire. That can kind of give us a clue as to the fire and smoke movement, what the wind direction and velocity is that affects the natural flow of fire. We want to look to see if any doors and windows are locked or unlocked. It would be unusual for people to have windows open in the middle of winter. I've got a friend that likes to leave the windows open in the middle of the winter. They sleep better that way. I can't see doing that myself, but and down at the bottom, location of the fire, you see a very neat fire path charred through the grass leading to the structure. That is very unnatural. So that would be a very important clue that we'd want to pick up on. Containers or cans, again, I remember I said arsonists sometimes use gas cans, but you want to look at anything else, any other kind of container that may be discarded in the area, old milk cartons. Those are easy to get and don't draw suspicion when you buy. Any kind of burglary tools, and that can be as simple as a screwdriver. It doesn't have to be anything fancy, but if they leave a tool behind, don't disturb the tool. Just mark where it is. Again, familiar faces. If we're taking photos at these incidents, we may start seeing the same face over and over again. And like I said earlier, a fire investigator friend of mine said that's one of the first things he does is start taking pictures of the crowd. And he says he's actually caught a couple arsonists that way because they just like to hang around. So some other conditions that should raise an index of suspicion, any kind of unusual odors. And once you've been in the fire service enough, you know what some of the usual odors are that you can expect at an incident scene. But when you start smelling things, petroleum products, just unusual odors, that should raise your index of suspicion. Any kind of obstacles that hinder actual firefighting, that would be kind of a big clue. They don't want you to put the fire out. They want you to. They want the fire to burn the building. Any kind of incendiary devices. If you come across one that has not activated, don't go near it. Some of those can be deadly. Look for any abnormal fire behavior when water is applied. There are some cases when when you spray an area on fire, it comes right back. That again should raise your index of suspicion. Trailers we've already talked about, and there's a very good picture one. We see two places where fires were started using flammable liquids that were kind of laid to that main area of fire there off to the right. Those are almost always very suspicious. Any kind of structural alterations, things that would not be natural, that might hinder fire structure. They might remove some of the particle or some of the what's that stuff called? Plaster, drywall. Thank you, drywall to expose the wood. Maybe they make a hole in the ceiling or the wall or floor. Doors, fire doors in particular, may be propped in an open position. Any of those should be kind of, again, raise your index of suspicion that something may not be kosher. And fire patterns, we've already kind of talked about any kind of unique fire patterns and fire patterns in general. To just to note again the fire's origin and direction of travel. Heat intensity. We can expect a certain amount of heat in any kind of fire. When we see high heat, that should raise our index of suspicion outside of any other factors. Again, when you do a little more homework on melting temperatures, and just you're not going to be able to remember them all, but if you have an understanding of what temperatures things melt at, that will give you a very quick indication of what the potential temperature was in that fire compartment. Look at where the documents are. In a fire, an accidental fire, something unplanned, people don't have time to remove important documents. So one of the, again, a factor that raises an index of suspicion is when important documents have been removed. When people remember to grab their wallets and their purse and their birth certificates and their passports, things like that. That's that's kind of key, because when a fire occurs, the first thing people want to do is get out. And some may grab something if it's not a particularly large fire, but I've been on quite a few where people have asked us to go get purses and cell phones and things like that because our lives are in those now. You want to look at fire protection systems. Again, kind of talked a little bit about this earlier. If there is an indication that a system that should be on was off, that could be a factor that raises your index of suspicion. If the systems were tampered with, any of you have flown know it's a federal violation to tamper with, and they give you a whole list, destroy, mutilate, spindle, whatever, the smoke detectors in the laboratory. So same kind of thing, looking at these protection systems, if they're there and if they worked, is very important. Intrusion alarms, kind of along the same vein. Were they tampered with? Were they turned off? The location of fire, again, we're looking for the ignition sources, the area of origin. Fires in areas where you would not expect fires to start could be a clue, like closets, bathtubs, file drawers, that kind of thing. Anything in the center of the floor kind of raises our index of suspicion. Personal possessions. Again, most people don't take the time to pack their mink coat and their laptops and everything else before they leave, their televisions. In a lot of cases in arson, people will remove valuable personal possessions, other valuables, TVs, stereo systems, that kind of thing, because they don't want that burned up in the fire. But that, again, raises our index of suspicion. Look at household items as well. Major household appliances, again, TVs falls into this, washers, dryers, freezers, refrigerators, things like that. If they're removed, or if they're removed and replaced with something less valuable, that might be, again, another factor to raise our index of suspicion. What kind of equipment or inventory? Again, home or business owners who are using arson to cover business losses, to claim insurance payment, may have replaced new equipment with older, obsolete, non-working kind of equipment. Inventory may have been replaced with something to substitute. Business records, again, these are these are things that are normally kept at the business. So in a fire where all your filing cabinets are empty, or all the business filing cabinets are empty, may be again an indication that somebody cleared out the records um, before they set the fire. So again, really important. Remember that we're not training you to be a fire investigator. We're training you to be aware of what arson is and what the fire investigator's role is, and what you can do in the very initial stages of the fire investigation. So go back and make sure you read that area on recognizing signs of arson, remembering that one or more of them present at a particular incident does not necessarily mean arson. It just raises our index of suspicion. All right, so learning objective 4, describe the importance of preserving evidence. Learning objective 5, explain techniques for preserving evidence. So remember that preserving evidence is responsibility of everyone at the scene. That's why this part or this information is included in the Fire 1 curriculum, so that everyone who is trained understands at least the basic concepts of arson investigation and evidence preservation. So protect anything that looks suspicious, anything that's out of place, anything that's odd. And remember that it takes special training to determine what is or isn't evidence. So like I said, there's a very good training course at the Academy if you're interested in fire investigation, where you can be trained to do that. So scene security is one of the first steps. So some early measures we can take. We can restrict scene access. How many times we've gone on particular scenes and everybody wants to come through to look at whatever's interesting. Maybe sometimes it's a suicide. Everybody wants to come through and look. Sometimes it's just something very unique. People want to come through and look. We have to restrict the access to the scene to anyone and everyone that doesn't have a need to be there. We want to protect potential evidence. We could post somebody by it to make sure it's not tampered with. And as we said before, minimize suppression and overhaul activities to only what's required to extinguish the fire until a fire investigator can take a look, and then we can do whatever destroying we want to after that, once the investigator says okay. So the first arriving investigator may adjust our security measures. They may implement new measures. Some of the there are some. All right, so the investigator's decision to adjust the measures or implement new ones is based on that investigator assessment of the scene, circumstances, and the measures already in place. They may request monitoring of the entrance. I mentioned this before, documenting anybody that comes in or goes out, and limiting access to only those that really need to be inside. So the perimeter. On explosions, the guideline is 1.5 times the distance of the furthest piece of evidence. In that particular diagram on the left, the furthest piece of evidence is about 100 yards, and so it's 50 yards past that. Structure, we kind of do this anyway, just enough of an area to protect the scene and any evidence that's on the outside. We want to use fire line tape. That's very important because our perimeter needs to be marked by something recognizable. Regular color kind of construction tape, caution tape may not be good enough. It really does need to say fire line do not cross. Make it very, very obvious. So some perimeters, we've already talked about making them easily recognizable. You can always start with a very large perimeter and work in. If you start with a perimeter that's too small, you may have evidence beyond that perimeter that could be contaminated by onlookers. So always establish a larger perimeter than you think you'll need at the very beginning. You can use law enforcement or firefighters to control. This is really kind of a law enforcement function, so we want police there as well. So criminal investigations impact the scene security practices we put in. Already talked about the entry log a couple times, permitting access to only those authorized. Moving personnel to a staging area is important. Once tasks are complete, it keeps them in one area. They don't disperse everywhere. If they have evidence stuck to their boots or whatever, it's contained. So if a fire investigator needs a crew to go in and just douse a little area with water, then they go in, do that, and come out and go back to that staging area. And that staging area could be right within that perimeter. Anybody else should always be escorted and mark potential evidence to prevent people from disturbing it. There are a number of different ways we can do that. We can use traffic cones. Those are probably the most available things we have. Incident investigation, crime scene investigation units, things units like that will have specific types of markers for evidence, and you guys have seen those on all the CSI episodes and all the other crime shows. So several techniques to preserving evidence. Number one, keep evidence untouched and undisturbed. It's very important that the fire investigator sees the evidence in the condition that it was found. So if you see something that you think is evidence, you don't want to pick it up. Don't gather or handle unless necessary to preserve. Like if you're removing something from a burning building that's in danger of being consumed by the fire, you want to make sure that if you do anything to anything that you think is evidence, you want to document it. The fire investigator needs to go back to determine where that piece of evidence was obtained. And of course, always follow department SOPs. You don't want to walk on, cross-contaminate, or destroy evidence. So if there is evidence that is on the ground, we want to kind of set up a perimeter around that as well. And one of the things I've seen, I'm kind of going through all my British crime dramas while I'm sequestered during this pandemic. But one of the things I like is that the Brits use a technique where they use their, I'll call it fireline tape, their crime scene tape, to create a pathway to the actual crime scene outside, within their perimeter. And this is probably a good technique that we should be employing to limit kind of that cross-contamination or walking over. Once we clear, for example, that front porch or that front walkway, we can set up a pathway using that crime scene or the fire line tape so that we can limit where people are going. Now, if they have to go somewhere else, that's fine, but we can limit where people are walking to reduce the possibility of them destroying evidence. Avoid excessive water use. Again, this goes back to the incident priorities. All right, stabilization requires that the fire be put out, but once we get the fire out, we want to limit our water use so it's not excessive. That can wash evidence away. We've already talked about footprints and any kind of tire marks. You're going to really have to be kind of looking, have real good situational awareness on a scene, because once the fire department gets there, we've got all this apparatus and their tire marks and all our footprints all over the place. So if you recognize something or see something right away, you want to protect that. And when paper is burned, sometimes it doesn't actually disintegrate. So closing dampers and other openings, windows, and that kind of thing will help that ash from being disturbed, those documents. Charred documents should be left alone. There is a way that they can be recovered if it's necessary. So obviously we want to protect those from airflow, which would make it disintegrate and scatter. So overhaul operations should be limited. Again, we're destroying potential evidence, right? We have to open up walls. We got to open up ceilings. We got to get into closets. That can destroy potential evidence. Delay that until the origin and cause can be determined, if at all possible. And then you can begin once critical evidence is protected. So we're not talking about postponement here. We're not talking about not doing overhaul operations. We're just talking about limiting it to what's absolutely necessary and then waiting until that critical evidence can be identified and protected. So there are two types of evidence kind of destruction, if you will. First one is contamination, and unfortunately, we're responsible for a lot of this. We may have smoking. How many times we've seen our guys smoking on an incident scene? They discard a cigarette. I'm seeing matchsticks, but we want to make sure that we're not adding any kind of cross-contamination or contamination to the crime scene. Walking through areas of flammable liquid traces, or flammable liquid can introduce trace amounts of those into other areas. One of the things I learned very early in my training is that when any two objects come in contact, something is left on each from one object to the other. It's called trace transfer evidence. And so if we walk through a puddle of flammable liquid in our fire boots, we're going to track that flammable liquid all through the house. And if a dog comes through to sniff out an accelerant, then that's going to make it more difficult for that person. Okay, spoliation or spoliation. Sorry, spoliation. That's something that occurs when the person responsible for protecting it doesn't protect it, and normally it's referred to or refers to actions that were done or not done by the fire investigator, but it could actually be ours too. So, in the implications of spoliation can vary, but again, I'll tell you that anytime the integrity of any piece of evidence is brought into question, the courts often err on the side of innocence. So if we have done something to a piece of evidence, destroyed it, changed it somehow, the courts could throw that evidence out as being inadmissible. So it's very, very important that we not leave our water bottles lying around. I mean, we do a lot of that at the fire scene. In rehab, maybe we need to take a better count of where we're putting our trash on a fire scene, because we're looking for discarded containers. Well, there we have 4 bottles of water. Were those left by firefighters or by someone who set the fire? So it just makes that job harder. All right, so after the investigation is complete, we want to secure the structure. We have that company now, and I can't remember the number off the top of my head, and I didn't look it up because I didn't think about it till just now, but I think it's 1-800-BOARD-UP. They'll come out and board up the doors and the windows. We want to secure the structure and then turn it over to the occupant. Now, in fire investigation, it's important that somebody stay on the scene until a fire investigator gets there. The reason is that while we are there as part of the initial response, we have the ability to enter the structure without a warrant because of what's called exigent circumstances. In other words, there's an emergency. The reasonable person would expect us to go in and take care of that emergency. But once we leave, that exigent circumstance is gone. So now investigator may have to go to court and get a warrant. So if at all possible, we want to remain there until the fire investigator gets there, just to make that job a little bit easier. So any kind of debris removal, we do this as part of overhaul. It may be the last thing we do on the scene. We really want to make sure that we've got that fire out. So, removing things that are more susceptible to smoldering, such as mattresses, couches, love seats, stuffed chairs, recliners, that kind of thing is very, very important. We do not want to rekindle. Rekindles are embarrassing. We want to separate the unburned debris that might be salvageable, right? That's part of salvage. And then dump debris where it's not visible if at all possible. That's a great way to improve our PR standard. So make sure that you understand the techniques that you can use as a firefighter to preserve evidence, to recognize evidence and preserve evidence. All right, so in summary, protecting that evidence is one of the most important responsibilities. Again, remember that the integrity of that evidence, the competency of that evidence, depends on ensuring that the investigator can document where that evidence originally came from and that it was in the custody of authorities all the way up until it came to court. Very, very important. That's chain of custody. Again, use appropriate caution in the area of origin for all numbers of reasons. Structure can be unstable. You don't want to destroy any evidence, that kind of thing. And a thorough investigation may be conducted to determine the exact cause of the fire.